What's gaming, gamers? Today, I've got a hunter build for you centered around the Assassin's Cowl exotic helmet and the solar subclass that will allow you to solo flawless any content in the game you want. This build is incredibly survivable, and unlike using Assassin's Cowl on the Arc subclass, this build doesn't explicitly require being within melee range of enemies to be granted the survivability innate to Assassin's Cowl. In fact, I just used this exact build a few days ago to solo flawless the Warlord's Ruin dungeon. The gameplay you're seeing in the background is footage from that run, and I'll be posting the full run alongside this video if you feel like watching the whole thing to see how this build plays in more detail. But before I get into the rest of the video, I'd like to shout out our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs. If you're looking for people to play any content in Destiny with, ranging from ritual playlist and seasonal activities all the way to raids and Grandmaster strikes, feel free to join the Discord server. We welcome anyone, no matter how new or seasoned you are, and all of us will teach encounters if you don't know something. If you're interested, hop into the Discord server and play some Destiny with us, the link is in the description. Additionally, if you'd like to watch me play games more often, come hang out with me over on Twitch. I usually play whatever game I feel like over there, and I stream Destiny often. Furthermore, if you have any questions about builds or build crafting in general, I love answering those. If anything I've said has piqued your interest, the link to my Twitch is in the description as well. To get into the build guide itself, I'll first start with describing the Assassin's Cowl exotic helmet and what it does in case you're not aware. Assassin's Cowl has the exotic perk Vanishing Execution, which allows powered melee final blows to grant you void invisibility for a differing amount of time depending on the tier of enemy killed, with higher tier enemies granting invisibility for longer amounts of time. Additionally, these powered melee final blows heal you for a differing amount of health. The amount of health you're granted is also strictly dependent on the tier of enemy killed, with higher tier enemies granting more health. Finisher final blows also grant you a longer duration of invisibility as well as more health per kill, so finishers are worth going for if you can get them off. The minimum and maximum duration of invisibility for powered melee kills is 6.8 seconds and 13.3 seconds respectively, with the amount of health corresponding to those durations of invisibility being 100 health and 200 health respectively. Finishers grant you invisibility for longer, with the minimum and maximum durations of invisibility via finisher final blow being 9.8 seconds and 15.8 seconds respectively, and all finisher final blows heal you for 200 health. Now that you know what Assassin's Cowl does, I can get into the rest of the build, starting with the subclasses setup. I'll first put everything on screen as a prescriptive setup if that's what you prefer, and once I've done that, I'll detail each subclass element, describing what they do, why I've chosen them, as well as any alternative options should there be any. For the prescriptive subclass setup, run the Blade Barrage Super, the Gambler's Dodge, whichever jump you prefer, the Knife Trick Melee, the Healing Grenade, the Knock 'em Down aspect, the On Your Mark aspect, Ember of Beams, Ember of Empyrean, Ember of Mercy, Ember of Searing, and Ember of Torches. To describe the subclass's setup, firstly the Super. Blade Barrage is chosen as it's a decent super for dealing with both groups of enemies as well as dealing damage to bosses, on top of the fact that the Golden Guns aren't really great without the Celestial Nighthawk exotic helmet. As I wanted this video to be describing one build and not having to describe loadout swapping, I decided the Blade Barrage was simpler. Furthermore, Blade Barrage deals a decent amount of damage and has a much shorter base cooldown than either of the Golden Guns, making it passively recharge noticeably faster than the Golden Guns. If you wanted, you could run one of the two Golden Guns, but I find Blade Barrage to be a simpler and frankly better option without loadout swapping to the Celestial Nighthawk exotic helmet. For the dodge, Gambler's Dodge is a must pick as it will fully refund your melee ability when used near enemies. As the melee ability is this build's main source of survivability, ensuring you have options for refunding the melee ability should you miss it is paramount to your survival and this build's effectiveness. As for the grenade, the Healing Grenade is brought as both the source of burst healing if you need it, as well as a source of the Restoration ×1 buff, which will be very helpful for your survival as well. The Healing Grenade's burst healing potential does encroach somewhat on Assassin's Cowl's role, but that's not reason enough not to bring the Healing Grenade. If you don't have a melee charge active, if there aren't any enemies nearby to kill with your melee ability, or you otherwise just need a quick instant burst of healing, the Healing Grenade is a fantastic utility for just that. Furthermore, the Restoration ×1 buff granted by the Healing Grenade will be incredibly beneficial to your survival while not invisible. All in all, these reasons make the healing grenade a very lucrative option. If you wanted, you could run any of the damaging grenades, but this build will be killing most enemies with the powered melee anyways, and as such, I don't find the damaging grenades to be all that useful. Onto the aspects. Firstly, Knock 'em Down will add 3 knives to each of the 2 knife volleys thrown by your Blade Barrage super, which causes your Blade Barrage to throw a total of 20 knives instead of its default of 14. This increases its effective damage potential by almost 50%, as well as its ad clearing potential, as the more knives thrown, the more ads can be damaged by the super itself. Additionally, Knock 'em Down will cause your powered melee final blows to fully recharge your powered melee so long as the final blow is acquired while you have the Radiant buff procced. Activating Radiant from the same hit that killed the enemy will also refund your melee ability, which will be done every single time your melee ability damages a target due to the Ember of Torches fragment. The second aspect to run is On Your Mark. On Your Mark will cause precision final blows to grant both you and nearby allies increases to both your weapon's handling and reload speed stats for 12 seconds. Every precision kill acquired while the buff is active will increase the amount of stacks you have up to a maximum of 3, as well as extending the buff's timer to its maximum of 12 seconds. Lastly, using your class ability will instantly grant you all 3 stacks of On Your Mark, but the class ability usage won't grant On Your Mark to your allies. While these weapon stat increases are helpful and at 3 stacks are very noticeable, On Your Mark is brought mostly for its 3 fragment slots. The Gunpowder Gamble aspect is also an option if you'd like, but you would have to sacrifice a fragment, and I find this build makes significant use of all 5 fragment slots, thus I choose to use On Your Mark. As for the fragments, firstly, Ember of Beams will increase the tracking capabilities of your Blade Barrage projectiles. This increases the total amount of damage your Blade Barrage will be able to deal, especially on smaller bosses and groups of ads. Additionally, Ember of Beams will increase your intellect stat by 10 points, but that isn't really important for this build and is simply a slight increase to your Blade Barrage's passive recharge rate. The second fragment, Ember of Empyrean, allows you to extend the duration of all Radiant and Restoration effects applied to you by getting kills with your solar weapons or abilities. This is important, especially for the Restoration buff. Even though Assassin's Cowl heals you upon getting powered melee kills, Majors, Champions, and Bosses can still do significant amounts of damage in very short amounts of time. The Restoration buff will help to nullify their damage on top of the healing and damage mitigation provided by Assassin's Cowl and its invisibility. Ember of Empyrean does come with a 10-point stat deficit to your Resilience stat, but that's offset by both the Restoration uptime granted by this fragment as well as the next fragment. Speaking of the next fragment, Ember of Mercy will grant you the Restoration ×1 buff for 2 seconds upon the collection of a Fire Sprite, and if you have the Restoration buff at the time you collect the Fire Sprite, your buff will instead be extended by 2 seconds. Furthermore, if playing in a fire team, when you revive a fire team member, both you and that ally will be granted the Restoration ×1 buff for 5 seconds. This is simply an extra source of the Restoration buff outside of your healing grenade and is invaluable to survivability when your healing grenade is on cooldown, when you don't have a melee charge, or if both of those things are true. Finally, Ember of Mercy grants you 10 points to your Resilience stat, which entirely offsets the 10-point Resilience deficit caused by Ember of Empyrean. Fourth for fragments is Ember of Searing. Ember of Searing will grant you a differing amount of melee energy after having killed a scorched target, depending on the tier of enemy killed. Additionally, after having defeated a scorched target, a Fire Sprite will be summoned, which will grant both grenade energy and the Restoration buff due to Ember of Mercy upon its collection. Ember of Searing's melee energy generation is a passive bonus to this fragment's effectiveness with this build, but won't see all too much usefulness unless you miss your Gambler's Dodge or don't have it off cooldown when you need to recharge your melee ability. However, the Fire Sprite will be incredibly beneficial to this build, as their generation will allow you to keep your Restoration buff procced while invisible, as well as without having to kill an enemy. Furthermore, the Fire Sprites themselves will grant you grenade energy once collected, which will help your healing grenades uptime a noticeable amount. Lastly, Ember of Searing comes with a 10-point stat bonus to your recovery stat, which will be helpful for your passive healing when you don't have the Restoration buff procced. Finally, for fragments, Ember of Torches will grant you the Radiant buff for 8 seconds upon damaging an enemy with your powered melee ability. Radiant is a fantastic tool for this build, as it increases all of your outgoing weapon damage by 25% while procced, as well as synergizing with this season's artifact very well. Having Radiant procced, and indeed extended, every time you use your powered melee on a target will increase your combat effectiveness by at least 25%. Ember of Torches does come with a 10-point deficit to your Discipline stat, but that's offset by the generation and subsequent collection of fire sprites. Alternatively, you can swap out Ember of Beams for either Ember of Singeing or Ember of Solace. Ember of Singeing will grant your class ability an additional 300% charge rate for 3 seconds upon applying any amount of Scorch stacks to an enemy. This 3-second duration acts as its cooldown and can't be reapplied during this time. However, it can be reprocced instantly after those 3 seconds have elapsed, and with this build's Scorch uptime, you won't have much downtime on Ember of Singeing whatsoever. Ember of Singeing is a great tool for your Gambler's Dodge's uptime, especially if you know yourself to have subpar aim or you feel the powered melee attacks are inconsistent, as those are both things that can cause you to miss your knife throws or simply not kill the enemy you've thrown your knife at. Having Gambler's Dodge off cooldown more often allows you to miss your knife more often without significantly costing you survivability. Next, Ember of Solace will increase the duration of all Radiant and Restoration effects applied to you by 50%. This doesn't increase the maximum duration of these buffs, that maximum remains at 15 seconds, but all sources which proc either Radiant or Restoration will proc those buffs and indeed extend those buffs by a duration 50% longer than their base. This is most impactful in combination with Ember of Mercy, as it will cause fire sprites to grant you Restoration ×1 for 3 seconds instead of 2. This doesn't sound like a lot of time, but with the cooldown between fire sprite generations being 5 seconds, if you're unable to extend your restoration timer via a solar kill, you'll only have 2 seconds without restoration instead of 3 before you can generate and collect another fire sprite. If you want to use either of those alternative fragments, I recommend swapping out Ember of Beams, as Ember of Beams only impacts your super. Ember of Beams itself is very helpful, but overall is used the least, and as such, I find it to be the least impactful of the 5 prescriptive fragments. With the subclasses setup now detailed, I can get into the seasonal artifact setup for use with this build if you're playing during Season 23, the Season of the Wish. This season's artifact synergizes fantastically with the Solar subclass, and as such, has plenty of mods that this build will benefit heavily from having equipped. In the first column, simply run whichever anti-champion mods you need for the content you'll be running. I generally prefer having my primary ammo weapon without an anti-champion mod, as then it'll be granted anti-barrier rounds by the Radiant buff, but if you need the champ mod for your main weapon to be unstoppable or overload rounds, that is an option with the first column. In the second column, the Kindling Trigger mod will cause the Radiant buff to allow your solar weapons to apply Scorch stacks to any enemy damaged by those weapons who are also currently unafflicted by Scorch. This is a great source of proccing the Ember of Searing fragment to grant yourself grenade energy and generate fire sprites, which will grant the Restoration ×1 buff and be very helpful for your survival. In the third column, the Flint Striker mod will grant you the Radiant buff upon getting rapid precision hits and or multi-kills with solar weapons. This is simply an extra source of the Radiant buff, and in combination with Ember of Empyrean and Ember of Torches, will cause you to effectively never lose Radiant so long as you're in combat. Next in the third column is the Torch mod. Torch will grant all of your weapons a slight 5% damage boost to any enemy afflicted with any stasis or strand debuffs, provided you have the Radiant buff procced. Stasis and strand debuffs include Slow, Freeze, Sever, Suspend, and Unravel, most of which can be procced with specific weaponry, so Torch is a great passive utility mod for increasing your weapon damage against bosses especially. Plus, with this build's significant Radiant uptime, you'll almost never not be able to take advantage of the Torch mod. Next, for the third column, the Heart of the Flame mod will grant you and nearby allies the Radiant buff for 10 seconds upon the casting of your Solar Super. Furthermore, Heart of the Flame grants your Solar Super a damage boost upon its cast, with nearby allies increasing the strength of the damage boost. This super damage boost does work while solo, and is a free 6% damage boost while solo to your Solar Super. Lastly, for the third column is the Wished Into Being mod. Wished Into Being will cause ability final blows when above a certain threshold of super energy, but not fully charged, to summon 3 orbs of power. Wearing Season of the Wish armor lowers the super energy threshold to summon these orbs of power, but I don't find that to be worthwhile over running armor you already have and use. With 0 or 1 piece of Wish armor equipped, you must be between 80% and 100% super energy to have these orbs of power summoned, and the cooldown between summoning these orbs of power is quite long. These orbs of power are a fantastic source of super energy, armor charge, ability energy, and health, and due to the fact that this build will be getting powered melee kills especially often, you'll proc Wished Into Being often, especially if you're paying attention to your super bar. In the fourth column, the Revitalizing Blast mod will simply cause damage dealt with your solar abilities to bosses and champions to apply the Void Weaken effect to those enemies for 6 seconds. This allows you to deal 15% more damage to those enemies for its 6-second duration, which can be significant especially for high damage sources like your Blade Barrage Super or your heavy weapon. Finally, in the fifth column, the Rays of Precision mod will grant precision final blows while radiant, the ability to cause the target killed to ignite, dealing damage to all enemies nearby to the one killed. This can be a fantastic utility for clearing groups of adds quickly, but can also be detrimental if you kill an enemy and then throw your knife at the next enemy only for them to be killed by the ignition you caused on the first enemy. As this is the case, ensure you're paying attention when you have this mod equipped to whether you've precision killed an enemy with your throwing knife. Now that I've described the artifact mods I recommend using with this build, I can get into my recommendations for stat distribution. In the top 3 stat grouping of Mobility, Resilience, and Recovery, spec into Resilience first, with Recovery and Mobility second in priority. Resilience is always the most important stat to spec into, regardless of class and build, as it dictates your overall health, shields, and damage resistance. That makes having a high Resilience stat imperative to survivability, especially on Solar, as Solar doesn't have any implicit damage resistance tools like most other subclasses do. As for Mobility and Recovery, both of these stats are just as important as the other for this build. Recovery is arguably more important, but this build will also have the Restoration ×1 buff active consistently, as well as the innate healing offered by both the Healing Grenade and the Assassin's Cowl exotic helmet, so you won't need as high a recovery stat as you might on another subclass or build. Mobility is the Hunter's class stat, which means you'll need at least a few points spec'd into it to ensure your Gambler's Dodge doesn't have an absurdly long cooldown. If you choose to run the Ember of Singeing fragment, you can forego some points in mobility, as Ember of Singeing will become your main source of class ability regeneration. However, I don't recommend going below 30 points in mobility, as that will make jumping puzzles and the like more difficult. For the bottom 3 stat grouping of Discipline, Intellect, and Strength, Strength will be the most important stat to spec into, with Discipline second, and Intellect can be ignored altogether. Discipline governs the base recharge rate of your grenade, and having your healing grenade off cooldown more often helps significantly with both your burst healing potential as well as your Restoration ×1 proccing capabilities. However, this build's Fire Sprite generation and collection capabilities, as well as armor mod choice, lower the need for Discipline, as you'll be actively regenerating your grenade ability often. This removes much of the requirement for Discipline, as Discipline only changes the passive cooldown of your grenade ability. Intellect is an entirely useless stat for this build. All Intellect does is reduce the base cooldown of your super. That may sound appealing, but everything that grants you super energy does so via a percentage, thus entirely removing the benefit of speccing into Intellect. Still, having at least Tier 3 Intellect will have your super at its base cooldown. Any less than Tier 3 and your super's base cooldown will be longer than its default. Lastly, Strength dictates the base recharge rate of your melee ability. This build's active melee regeneration capabilities in both the Ember of Searing fragment and the Gambler's Dodge are significant, but I like to spec into Strength as it helps if I've lost my knife between encounters. Having a higher Strength stat allows my melee ability to passively recharge faster, and when there aren't any enemies around, to proc Ember of Searing or to use my Gambler's Dodge nearby. The Strength stat ensures my melee ability is charged before I enter combat. My armor's stats have me at 60 mobility, 100 resilience, 60 recovery, 54 discipline, 40 intellect, and 71 strength. With stat distribution now detailed, I can get into the armor's mod setup for this build, starting with the prescriptive setup. I'll put everything on screen first if that's what you prefer, and once I've done that, I'll detail what each mod does, why I've chosen it, as well as any alternative options should there be any. For the prescriptive armor mod setup, on your helmet, run 2 hands-on mods and 1 harmonic siphon mod. On your arms, run 1 grenade kickstart mod and 1 impact induction mod. On your chest piece, simply run whichever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running. On your legs, run 1 absolution mod, 1 innervation mod, and 1 recuperation mod. Lastly, on your cloak, run 1 bomber mod, 1 powerful attraction mod, and 1 reaper mod. To detail the armor's mods, firstly the helmet's mods. The 2 hands-on mods will serve to grant you super energy upon getting kills with your powered melee ability. You'll be doing this often, as powered melee kills will be your most significant source of survivability, so being granted extra super energy for getting them is a nice passive bonus to your super's uptime. If you want, you could swap out one of the hands-on mods in favor of a heavy ammo finder mod, but ability kills don't progress the ammo finder counter, so keep that in mind if you choose to use an ammo finder. The Harmonic Siphon mod will cause multi-kills with your solar weapons to summon an Orb of Power, which will grant you armor charge, super energy, ability energy, and health upon its collection. Orbs of Power will be very helpful for this build for all of the reasons mentioned, and as such, their generation and collection will go far to increase this build's combat effectiveness. Onto the arms mods, the Grenade Kickstart mod will refund you a differing amount of grenade energy upon the use of your grenade ability depending on the amount of stacks of armor charge you have when you use your grenade. The more stacks of armor charge you have, the more energy you'll be refunded, which makes collecting orbs very helpful for your grenade's uptime. Furthermore, having any armor charge mod equipped allows you to collect orbs of power while your super is full, meaning you can be granted their ability energy, armor charge, and health even while your blade barrage is fully charged. Next, the Impact Induction mod will instantly grant you grenade energy upon dealing any powered melee damage. Impact Induction has an intrinsic 7-second cooldown between activations, meaning you can only be granted this grenade energy once every 7 seconds. However, as you'll be using your melee ability constantly to heal yourself and proc invisibility, you'll be granted this grenade energy almost instantly off cooldown. For your chest pieces mods, simply running whichever resistance mods you need for the content you'll be running will suffice. For the gameplay you're seeing in the background, and indeed that entire solo flawless run of the Warlord's Ruin dungeon, I ran 2 void resistances alongside 1 arc resistance, as those were the damage types I was most worried about. However, if just running this build in general content, simply think about the damage types you'll be facing the most and use the resistance mods that correspond to those. Onto the legs mods, firstly, the Absolution mod will grant you a small amount of ability energy for all 3 of your abilities upon the collection of any Orb of Power with no cooldown. This mod is simply brought as a passive boost to the uptime of your abilities and will help mostly with your Gambler's Dodge's uptime, especially if you choose not to use the Ember of Singeing fragment. Next, in addition to the Absolution mod, the Innervation mod will grant you grenade energy upon the collection of any Orb of Power with no cooldown. The amount of energy granted by Innervation is additive to the amount granted by Absolution, and those 2 mods together will grant you more grenade energy per orb collected than 2 Innervation or 2 Absolution mods together would, which is why I choose to run this specific combination of mods. Lastly, the Recuperation mod will grant you 67 health upon the collection of any Orb of Power with no cooldown. Recuperation simply increases the amount of healing options you have and is especially helpful while you're invisible, as you don't have to become visible to collect an Orb of Power to heal yourself. Lastly, for the mods on your cloak, the Bomber mod will grant your healing grenade energy instantly upon the use of your Gambler's Dodge. Bomber is brought mostly as a passive buff to your healing grenade's uptime and isn't necessarily a mod I recommend using to actively replenish grenade energy. Rather, a Bomber is brought to grant a small amount of grenade energy anytime your grenade happens to be on cooldown when you need to use your Gambler's Dodge. Next, the Powerful Attraction mod will simply act as another passive bonus for this build, allowing you to collect Orbs of Power that would otherwise be too dangerous to collect simply by using your Gambler's Dodge. Powerful Attraction, in combination with the Recuperation mod, has saved me many times. If I've missed my knife, I usually find myself low on health in the wake of it, and when using my Gambler's Dodge to refund my throwing knife, I often collect an Orb of Power I missed previously or hadn't even known was there. It's for this reason I recommend running Powerful Attraction, as it can save you when you don't even expect it to. Lastly for mods is the Reaper mod. Reaper will cause your next weapon final blow within 10 seconds of having used your class ability to summon an Orb of Power. Reaper does have a 10-second cooldown that only starts once you've summoned an Orb of Power, and this cooldown will prevent the use of your class ability from allowing your first weapon final blow to summon an Orb of Power. Reaper is simply brought as an extra Orb of Power whenever you happen to use your Gambler's Dodge, and as both the generation and collection of Orbs of Power are useful for this build's effectiveness, I recommend bringing the Reaper mod. Now that the armor setup has been entirely detailed, I can get into my recommendations for specific weapons and weapon perks for use with this build. I'll detail my recommendations for kinetic slot weapons first, then energy slot weapons, and finally heavy slot weapons with exotic weapons last. So for the kinetic slot, my recommendation is to run a special weapon, as any special weapon you run will make short work of majors, champions, and mini-bosses. Fusion rifles and shotguns would be my main recommendations, as this build will have you in close quarters with enemies consistently. As that's the case, snipers and trace rifles won't have the same effectiveness as fusions and shotguns will. Additionally, with the Torch mod granting you more damage while radiant against enemies afflicted with stasis and strand debuffs, running any weapon with either chill clip or slice are great options for dealing a little bit of extra damage to bosses specifically. As for specific kinetic slot weapons I recommend, there are the Riptide Stasis Fusion Rifle from the Crucible weapon pool with the perk combination of auto-loading holster and chill clip, the Scatter Signal Strand Fusion Rifle from the Season of the Wish with the perk combination of Controlled Burst and Slice, the Swordbreaker Strand Shotgun from the Crota's End Raid with the perk combination of 1-2 Punch and Pugilist, and the Wastelander M5 Kinetic Shotgun from Dares of Eternity with the perk combination of Pugilist and Trench Barrel. Onto the energy slot, I recommend a primary ammo solar weapon in this slot, as that'll synergize with this build the best, as well as having infinite ammo, so you don't need to farm special ammo to have a weapon synergize with your build. As this is a close range build, weapons like submachine guns and hand cannons work best, but there are plenty of options for specific weapons to run. Weapons in the energy slot I recommend you use are the Bug Out Bag Solar Submachine Gun from the Season of the Deep with the perk combination of Incandescent and Threat Detector, the BXR-55 Battler Solar Pulse Rifle from Dares of Eternity with the perk combination of Incandescent and Pugilist, the Callus Mini-Tool Solar Submachine Gun from the Season of the Haunted, now acquirable via the Presage Exotic Mission with the role of Incandescent and Threat Detector, and the Zowli's Bane Solar Hand Cannon from the King's Fall Raid with the perk combination of Explosive Payload and Incandescent. For your heavy slot, as this build doesn't take advantage of any solar weapon surge mods, you can really use whatever heavy weapon you want. I find myself using an exotic in this slot most of the time, but I'll go over exotics shortly. Legendary heavy weapons I recommend using with this build include the Apex Predator Solar Rocket Launcher from the Last Wish Raid with the perk combination of Bait and Switch and Reconstruction, the Ascendancy Solar Rocket Launcher from the Season of the Lost, now purchasable from the Monument to Lost Lights in the Tower with the perk combination of Explosive Light and Impulse Amplifier, the Cold Comfort Stasis Rocket Launcher from the Ghosts of the Deep dungeon with the perk combination of Bait and Switch and Envious Assassin, and the Semi-Optician Strand Rocket Launcher from the Season of the Witch with the perk combination of Explosive Light and Impulse Amplifier. As far as exotic weapons go, there are plenty of options. The kinetic slot has weapons like the Bastion Kinetic Fusion Rifle and the Conditional Finality Stasis and Solar Shotgun from the Root of Nightmares raid. The energy slot has weapons like the Sunshot Solar Hand Cannon and the Vex Mythoclast Solar Fusion Rifle from the Vault of Glass raid, and the heavy slot has my personal favorite exotic weapon to run with this build, the Dragon's Breath Solar Rocket Launcher. I like Dragon's Breath the most as it's a very set and forget exotic. I can shoot it once at a mini-boss or boss, and then if I need to, I can use my power and melee on an enemy to go invisible while Dragon's Breath damages the boss for me. Then, once I've procced enough ignitions, Dragon's Breath reloads itself and I can shoot it at the boss again, only to then go right back to being invisible should I need to. However, any of the exotics I've just mentioned will work fantastically with this build, so use all of them and see which one suits you the most. My loadout for the solo flawless run of the Warlord's Ruin dungeon you're watching in the background had me run the Riptide Stasis Fusion Rifle with the perk combination of auto-loading holster and chill clip in my kinetic slot, the Zowli's Bane Solar Hand Cannon with the perk combination of Explosive Payload and Incandescent in my energy slot, and the Dragon's Breath Exotic Rocket Launcher. I didn't change my weapons throughout the entire dungeon. This loadout worked well with this build especially. But now that I've gone over the entire build, I can get into some playstyle tips and tricks I have for use with this build. Firstly, never be afraid to simply use your powered melee on an enemy, become invisible, and hide for a bit. It can help you keep your composure, get yourself to a better position, or simply collect a few orbs of power or ammo bricks completely safe from harm. Reluctance to go invisible can very quickly lead to your demise, as I've unfortunately learned the hard way, so use Assassin's Cowl as it's designed to be used as often as you need. As far as everything else goes, this build functions much the same as any other melee-oriented build. Use your melee ability on enemies close to you, use your special ammo weapon on mages that won't die to one throw of your knife, use your primary ammo weapon on enemies that are too far away to be meleeed, and use your heavy ammo weapon on bosses and champions to whom large amounts of damage need to be dealt. And that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. Again, if you'd like to join our clan, the Tyrant Seraphs, the link to the Discord server is in the description. Furthermore, if you'd like to watch me stream some games sometime, come hang out with me over on Twitch. The link for that is also in the description. If you have any questions or constructive criticisms, please leave them in the comments. I read all of them and reply to all that I can. Thank you again for watching, and have a great day!